Today is July 27th, 2021. I'm Leah Cohen, the Oral History Manager at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. On behalf of PMML, I am pleased to interview Captain David Lebowitz, who served with the U.S. Air Force with the 66th Tactical Reconnaissance Wing and the 501st Tactical Control Group on active duty, and later he served in the active duty for another 6 years. We welcome also Colonel Ken Yoshitani, who served 2 tours in Vietnam. And thanks for facilitating this interview. And thank you for coming in. So we'll start with your background. Where and when were you born?
Bridgeport, Connecticut, in 1932.
And what was it like growing up in Bridgeport at the time?
Well, I thought these were interesting years. I was born during the Depression, and things weren't great for my family. They weren't bad, but it was a time when money was very tight and such. So we didn't do a lot of traveling and that sort of thing that kids do today, I guess. And then along came World War II in 1941, and for the next few years, life was under wartime conditions, which was probably, again, a unique kind of experience in my growing up years. Almost everything seemed, to me, as a kid, surrounded by the situation that was going on with the war. So that I think that affected my growing up a whole lot. There were things that you learned to deal with that maybe if I had been born 10 or 15 years later, I wouldn't have had to deal with. So, that part of growing up was perhaps between 41 and 46, somewhat different.
What's an example of something you learned how to deal with?
Learned how to, pardon me?
Learned how to deal with.
Well, I guess one of the things was I didn't have a lot of young relatives, male relatives around me, because everybody was in the military. All my slightly older cousins, when I was in my later years in grammar school and high school, weren't around. The kind of relatives that you have that are part of what you learn from, really. So that was something that was different, and our life was we lived during war rationing, so we had this big garden in our backyard, which we used because we raised food that we actually ate, and because you couldn't buy a lot of stuff. I can recall my parents canning a lot of stuff because we couldn't. In fact, when I was a kid, one of the staples of my diet, I think, was ketchup, and you couldn't buy ketchup. It was rationed, and my family was not going to spend their ration points on ketchup. So we made ketchup. That's, that kind of thing was different. When I was in school, the kids in school, part of your things that you did in school was you bought what were called war stamps or defense stamps, and you filled up books with these little, if anybody remembers green stamps, we didn't have green stamps. We had defense stamps, and they cost, I think, a quarter. And you pasted them in a book until you had $18.75, and then it was converted into a war bond. And you were doing your bit to help the war effort. That was part of it. And your garden was called the Victory Garden. And so I guess life was kind of a little militaristic in my growing up. I didn't realize it at the time, but in retrospect, that's what it was. So these were things that, we dealt with. We didn't travel because gas was rationed, and my father had a sticker on the car that said he could only buy so many gallons of gas every month, and he used it to go back and forth to work, and that was about it. And in those days, people traded in cars more frequently, except after 1941, there were no cars being made. so that didn't happen for several years. So that part of our life changed too. Small things, but like that. That was part of my, all part of my growing up, I guess.
Out of curiosity, did you have to give fruits and vegetables to the military from the Victory Garden?
No, that was pretty much for our own family's use, and basically, because when you bought things at the supermarket, you had ration books, and you had to give up ration points. You were only allowed so much per person every month. And so in order to stretch out your ration points, you used your home garden to it so that you could use your ration points for meat, for instance, which you couldn't make yourself. So that was part of it.
What was your father's occupation?
My family was in the mattress manufacturing business. My grandfather's business, actually. And my father, who was a son-in-law, worked in the business. And during World War II, most of the mattresses that they made were for the military. In fact, my family there was a factory in Connecticut and a factory in Chicago, and the Chicago factory was solely devoted to making mattresses for the Navy, mostly for hospital beds. And I remember hearing my father tell me that they actually had a naval officer stationed in the factory to make sure that everything was being done according to the Navy standards. So
it met regulations.
That's an interesting part of the business that had to do with the military, I guess.
Where did your grandparents come from?
Well, my maternal grandparents, my maternal grandfather came from whatever that part of the Pale of Settlement was owned by at any given time. He spoke German, Polish, Russian, Yiddish, and a little bit of English. His wife's family came from Germany. My father's parents came from Hungary, both. My father was their first child born in the United States. And they had two sons in Hungary, and my father was born in New York. And my mother was born in Connecticut. So I was second generation American.
So where did you go to school?
elementary school, Madison School in Bridgeport, Connecticut, first through eighth grade. I never went to kindergarten, by the way, but first through eighth grade was at Madison School. And my high school was Central High School in Bridgeport. There were 3 high schools in the town. And then my college was at the University of Pennsylvania.
And which subjects interested you when you were growing up?
Well, I would say more on the history and political science kind of stuff. English, I liked writing and reading, more so than the sciences, which was a great disappointment to my father, who was a science major in college and had dreams of being a doctor, but couldn't afford medical school, so ended up in the mattress business with that. When it got to math and science, I did all right in it in school, but it was not what I really liked doing.
Yeah. Did your mother work in the family mattress business as well?
No, my mother was a mother and a housewife all the time.
Yeah.
When I was growing up.
Which activities did you like to do after school, or sports, or hobbies?
Well, like all little kids, I won't say I was an athlete. I never was. But I like to play basketball primarily. That was my favorite. But I played baseball, football, and basketball growing up. And of course, in the wintertime, outdoor stuff. I loved snow. And since I was in a hilly part of the country, it was a good place to grow up. But I was never a good enough athlete, let's say, to be on a high school team or a college team. But I enjoyed it, what I did.
Did you also go skiing?
No, I never skied until I was an adult, and I didn't do much of it then.
Did you also go to Hebrew school?
I was growing up, from the time I was in first grade, I think, I went to Sunday school. My family belonged to a Reform congregation, and Hebrew was kind of an afterthought in those days. This was pre-Israel, when Hebrew was a dead language used for prayer, but not for conversation. So we had about an hour of Hebrew every week in Hebrew school, in which you managed to learn the alphabet and a few prayers, and that was about it. So it was very limited in my growing up.
Did you have a bar mitzvah?
No, because that was what was called classical reform, which had revolted against the idea of bar mitzvah and said that a 13-year-old child was not old enough to call himself an adult, and therefore they did confirmation at 15 or 16. That was part of the Reformation, we'll say.
What was the nature of the confirmation?
That's interesting. First of all, in my growing up in a town like Bridgeport, most of the families, even if they belonged to the Reformed congregation, came from conservative or Orthodox congregations, and the men in their families had bar mitzvahs and such, if not the girls,
No.
primarily. But so they wanted their sons, many of them wanted their sons to have bar mitzvahs, which they couldn't do at the Reform Temple. So as a result, when it got to confirmation studies, which you started about a year before you were confirmed, the class consisted of 3 boys and about a dozen girls. Notable at that time because at that age, all the girls were taller than the boys.
True.
Anyway, and confirmation service was virtually all in English, with a very minimal amount of Hebrew prayer, and the rabbi wrote all our speeches, and the whole year was spent learning our speeches and learning how to present them. It was terrible from a young boy's standpoint to be in that situation. Really, I hated it.
Oh, well, you mentioned you're second generation and a lot of your cousins who were a bit older than you were serving in World War II. But was there concern in your family about relatives in Europe? Were people still in touch with relatives in Europe at that point?
I didn't hear a lot about it growing up. I imagine there was. Certainly my grandfather, I didn't have a lot of contact with my paternal grandparents. Because of the family business, most of my contact was with my maternal grandparents. And my maternal grandmother died very young anyway, so I was only about 9 or so when she passed away. So I didn't get a lot of contact, a lot of feedback on what was going on with family, and they never really. My parents, of course, having both been brought up in the United States, didn't know any of the family that was in Europe, and I don't think my grandfather spent a lot of time. Although I do know that not during the war, but previously he had made trips back and forth to Europe to visit family. I'd heard that. Yeah, but that was all. I really didn't have much contact with that situation.
Yeah. And did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had one sister, older. She's 3.5 years older than I am.
Okay. What did you do after you graduated from high school?
Well, my summers from the time I was about 12 years old were spent in the mattress factory, so learning the business from the bottom up. And that's what I did until I started college in the fall. I graduated in June. In September, I started college.
So do you want to say which college you went to?
University of Pennsylvania.
And I think you mentioned the Wharton Business School?
Yes, Wharton School of Business, yeah.
So was it a very pioneering institution? Like I was reading that Wharton was the one that had the first collegiate business school. And what was your program like?
What it was like, I can explain best by the fact that I encouraged all my children not to go to liberal arts school as undergraduates, because in retrospect, it was strictly business from beginning to end. Every course you took was business oriented. If you took psychology, it was business psychology. When you took English, it was business letter writing, and you took accounting, you took business law, you took statistics, business statistics, marketing, studies in industry, finance, accounting. That was course after course. And you, through your first 3 years, you had to take so many credit hours in your business courses. There was no room for electives in liberal arts. I think my first elective course I took in my senior year, and I had one in liberal arts, and that's what it was. It was like going to a trade school, really. I think it's different now, but because now there's much more emphasis on the liberal arts, and you get an MBA if you want business education today. But when I was going to college, the goal was to get a Bachelor of Science in economics, of course.
Did you study Did you study there because you hoped to join the family business?
Well, yeah, I guess that was sort of the goal. I mean, it was probably why my father was willing to invest in my education, because he wanted me to. And I was, in my generation, my grandfather only had 3 grandchildren, my sister and a cousin who was much younger than I was. So I was sort of the heir apparent, I guess, at that point in my life, whether I knew it or not, or whether I wanted it to be or not. But that was a fact. By the way, the only non-business course I took during that 3 or 4 years was ROTC.
So that's what I just about to ask you. How did you get into ROTC, and why did you choose the Air Force ROTC versus one of the other services?
Okay. So in 1950, when I entered college, the draft was on for Korea. But not so seriously. It wasn't at that point. They were drafting guys in their mid-20s, or after college pretty much age. But if you wanted to go to college, you could get a college deferment to be in school. But the less risky way was to join ROTC and get an ROTC deferment, which was pretty certain to postpone you. It was certain that you would go into the military, probably, if the war was still on. But it was, you would at least get your college in first. And so that was probably the incentive. I really wasn't too keen on it, but my roommate at the time, who I didn't know until he was assigned as my roommate, came from Macon, Georgia, and he had gone to a high school where they had ROTC in high school in those days. So he was into it. He was in the Army ROTC, and we were talking about, well, what are we going to do, about this ROTC? They presented, the military presented the programs to us when we went to our orientation in college, and he and I were talking about it, and he said, I'm going to go in. He said, it's not bad. I did it in high school, and, it doesn't take it takes up some time and credit hours. You got college credit for it, of course, thus eliminating other liberal arts possibilities. but you got first 2 years, I think you got 1 or 2 credits you took it instead of gym. So instead of your gym credits, I think the 3rd and 4th year you got more credit for it. But you had to take it. Once you signed up, you agreed to take 2 years of it, and then beyond that was again another deal. So he decided the Air Force, so we agreed. We joined. It was no, really, the Naval, there were all three services were at Penn. The Naval was mostly made up of people who were on Navy scholarship programs. There were some Army scholarship, and I think there were some Air Force scholarship people. I don't recall if there were many. Navy people were pretty much scholarship people. In fact, many of the Navy people had already served in the Navy during World War II at that time, but it was a way to get a free college education. So anyway, so we, that was why we joined the ROTC.
And what did it involve? What did the courses require?
Well, most of it, you had classroom where you learn some military history, and you got to learn what the ranks were, and some things. Your courses were taught mostly by non-commissioned officers. There were, I think there was in the case of the Air Force ROTC, there was a colonel who was in charge of the program. Most of the officers who were assigned to ROTC were there so that they could get free college training. They weren't so wrapped up in the ROTC program as they were in their own careers. And I think the non-coms were there because it was good duty. So they got extra allowances for living at the university, and it was, there were all sorts. But you took, and you had drill. You did a lot of marching. I was never good at marching. I'm not that well coordinated.
Like it should march in a certain rhythm or pattern.
Yeah, and you had on days when you had your classroom, you didn't have to do it in uniform. Days you had a drill, you had to do it in uniform. So you had to wear. You're going to classes too, so you wore the uniform all day, which was kind of a pain in the neck, but. Because it increased your cleaning bills.
True. Did you have to do anything with the Air Force ROTC in the summertime, like go off to a stint?
See, only in your junior year. You spent, I think, 6 weeks at an air base between your junior and senior year. And I went to Stewart Air Force Base, which was right next to West Point. So, and there you met guys at ROTC, no women, by the way, in those days, from all over the country, really. Well, mostly East Coast. I think they did it, sent you to camps that were reasonably close to your home. And my home was in Connecticut, so Stewart was probably the nearest. Stewart was not a major Air Force base. It was a very small base. It was basically there to serve West Point, I think. But so, in fact, I don't think there were any real military planes on Stewart when I was there. It was just an air base, and they had a flight line, and the only planes we ever flew in were C-47s, which were cargo planes. But that was the turning point in my ROTC education. Because
why was it a turning point?
At that point, while we were at summer camp, Korea had ended, and the Air Force was doing what they called a RIF, reduction in force. and they were active duty military were being deactivated. Not so much what were called regular Air Force, but the bulk of the Air Force, at least, was made up of reserve active duty people who were career people, or thought they were career people, but they were being deactivated. So the Air Force said, well, we're getting rid of a lot of senior officers, majors and colonels and whatnot. Why are we hiring a bunch of new second lieutenants? While we were about 2 weeks into summer camp, an announcement came down from the Air Force headquarters that ROTC graduates in our class would not get commissions in the Air Force when we graduated. So they called us all together and announced this to us. And here we are at summer camp. We have 3 years of ROTC invested, that we've invested time and effort in. And we're told, you're not going to get commissioned when you're going to get, you're free to go home if you want. If you're not going to, if you want to go home, you can go home. Except this is right about now in July, maybe a little earlier in July. You still have about 4 weeks of summer camp, ROTC summer camp to go. And when you walk out the gate, we will have to notify your draft board. You are no longer in ROTC. Now, when you get back to school in September, you can apply for what was called a 2AS student deferment. But between now and July and September, you are completely unprotected, and the Army is still drafting people, and they're drafting 18-year-olds at this point, and we're all 21, thereabouts. So told us, the chances are you might get drafted into the Army before you can get back to school. But go ahead and, and leave. You're free to leave. Tough decision. Not too many people left. No. Needless to say, we didn't exactly respond enthusiastically to our rest of our summer camp, but we got through it. We did it. So the next question I had was, okay, I'm going back to college. Once I'm in school, I can get my student deferment. Why should I waste my time taking ROTC my senior year when I could be taking something I'd enjoy taking instead? So I was all set when I got back. I was going to drop ROTC. Well, the university said, oh, you can drop it. The only thing is, if you drop ROTC in your senior year, you lose credit for the ROTC the previous years. So, which is okay if you want to do it, but in order to graduate, I'd have to make up those credits all within 1 year, which was impossible, really. So, guess what? I stayed in ROTC my senior year, even though there was no real reason for me to stay in ROTC, but they had to do it. So, my feelings about the military were, to say the least, not really great at that time. It was not really a happy time for me as far as the Air Force was concerned.
So here you are, you finish the ROTC, you get the college credit. You don't have to be worried about being drafted by the Army, but you won't be commissioned. You would not be commissioned either.
Okay. That's the point.
Yeah.
So graduation comes along. It's near graduation. Army is still drafting. You can get around the draft sometimes by going to graduate school, law school, or thereabouts. But chances are most of my friends in my graduating class who weren't in ROTC were going to go into the Army. So the Air Force came out with a new deal. You could get a commission in the Air Force if you agreed to go to flight training.
Oh.
But whereas the agreement for being commissioned in the Air Force before all this was you serve for 2 years on active duty as an officer, and then 6 years of reserve, but as an officer. Now, the new deal, only if you went to flight training, but then you had to agree to serve for 4 years because they weren't going to train you as a pilot, a navigator, or a bombardier unless you agree to stay around for 4 years, because they spend almost 2 years training you. So you had to agree for 4 years. Well, it became a moot question because your eyes had to be 20/20 in order to go to flight school for any of those things. And my eyes weren't correctable 20/20, so I wasn't eligible. So then they said, okay, we have another proposition for you. You can join your state Air National Guard. Get a commission in your Air National Guard as a second lieutenant and go on active duty with the Air Force for 3 years as an Air National Guard officer on active duty for training purposes, whatever that means. Or you could enlist in the Air Force as an enlisted man for 2 years. Normal enlistment in the Air Force was a 4-year enlistment. Or you could do none of the above and get drafted into the Army. Or if you were real lucky, you could graduate and maybe it turns out you're not eligible physically to go after all this, which did happen to some people. They were what we call 4F, physically unable to serve. Okay, so here you're faced with this. Well, 2 years in the Air Force or 2 years in the Army. If you took the Air Force, they gave you one little bonus. When you enlisted in the Air Force, normally for 4 years, you went in at what was called an Airman Basic, which Army terms buck private. But if your 4 years of ROTC was good enough to make you an Airman Third Class, which was like a PFC.
Give you a little start. Yeah.
So, on balance, the life of an enlisted man is better in the Air Force than it is in the Army, in my estimation. Now, my friend, the colonel over there, might disagree with that, but I didn't. Anyway, so I elected. I said I didn't want to go in for 3 years. I'd rather go for 2 years, and so I'll enlist in the Air Force, which is what I did.
But so were you under any obligation to do the 6 years of inactive duty at the time that you had?
I had the same obligation.
Yeah.
I would have that obligation in the Army. If you were drafted in the Army, they had a 6-year obligation too, I think. I'm pretty sure they did. But anyway, yeah. But, Korea was over by at that point, so I wasn't seriously thinking about the 6 years as having an impact on my life, except there's another little part of that came in later. Anyway, so I graduated in June, and on July 4th, I gave my girlfriend her an engagement ring.
Oh, you met her when you were at college?
Yeah, I met her in college, yes. And we got engaged on July 4th. On July 5th, I enlisted in the Air Force. Assuming she had a year of college to finish, assuming that I'd be in the Air Force and, I would get leaves and such and whatnot, and we could get together, and wherever I was, she could, when she was off on vacation, she could come where I was, and we could be together, back and forth. And so I enlisted. They put me on a bus, and I went to Sampson Air Force Base in Geneva, New York, which interestingly wasn't an Air Force base previously. It had been a naval base because it was on Lake Geneva, and it was a naval training base, but it was a basic training base for the Air Force. I did not have to take basic training. What I did have to take was 3 weeks of what they called re-enlistee training, which was given to people who'd been out of any branch of the service but had decided they didn't like civilian life, or civilian life didn't like them, and they wanted to re-enlist, and they chose the Air Force, so they had to go through this 3 weeks of re-enlistee training to be indoctrinated. And I had to learn how to be an enlisted man instead of an officer. That was their, I guess, the Air Force rationale.
Was the actual training very different to that which you did during ROTC?
No, it was very much the same, except that you were in it 24 hours a day, and thrown in with, instead of with a group of your fellow college students, guys, most of whom had been in the military, a lot who had seen combat and whatnot, and gotten back in, all kinds of situations. But it was a regular basic training base where they had people doing long-term basic training, regular basic training as well. And mostly marching.
Did you have to learn?
It was not very great fun for 2 weeks, and learning how to crawl under fire and that sort of thing in the mud, and doing your own laundry.
Did you have to learn how to use any ammunition or shoot?
Oh yeah, you fired on the firing range and did all that stuff. Well, we did that in summer camp too. I mean, it was sort of like summer camp, ROTC summer camp, really, over again. Yeah.
And where were you living when you were at the Sampson?
Where
did you live? Like, were there barracks?
Barracks.
Yeah.
Yeah. The funny thing, because it had been a naval base, the barracks were designated as ships, but that was about as close as to the Navy as we got. But yeah, we were segregated. We weren't with the rest of the basic training population. We were in our own units of the so-called re-enlistees. That was only 3 weeks long. And then they shipped all of those people out all over the place to wherever. But in my unit, there were 5 of us that were in the same boat that I was. 3 of them had graduated from Iowa State University as animal husbandry majors. I don't know what the 4th guy, where he was from. Anyway, the base had decided they were going to keep us there because we had 4 years of ROTC training. We knew all about this marching stuff and whatnot. We would be ideal to have as trainers for basic trainees.
Oh.
That was not a great thing, by the way. Well, it was great in terms of to a certain extent for me, in terms of location, because my wife was from upstate New York, and I was stationed in Geneva, New York. My wife, my fiance, at least during the summer, she was home. So they were going to keep us on the base, but they hadn't assigned us yet, and we were what were called casuals on the base. That means unassigned to anything, but given odds and ends of jobs to do to keep us busy during the day. And most of my time was spent guarding prisoners who were not locked up but free to roam around, because they were mostly awaiting less than honorable discharges for one reason or another. And that's about what I was doing. And I was doing it for about a week or so when the Air Force said to the basic training base, you can't do that to these guys, with these guys. We only have them for 2 years. The normal situation after basic training, and the reason the Air Force got people to enlist for 4 years as opposed to the Army for 2 years was when you went in, you were assured that you would go to some kind of a school that would train you in some career area which may or may not be useful in civilian life. So all these guys were going off to schools after basic training. They weren't going to send us to school for anything. So they did something that I consider probably unique in military. They said, these people have to be assigned to job specifications as close as possible to their college major. Imagine that. So my college major, well, my degree said economics. My major in college was industrial management at Wharton. And there was a thing in the Air Force, the Army calls them MOSs, the Air Force calls them AFSC, your job classification. There was an AFSC called Manpower Management Specialist. So that looked like something that I should be, I guess they decided. So they decided they were going to make me a Manpower Management Specialist.
So,
well,
go on,
in the Air Force, the way you got that title was it was only granted to non-commissioned officers, because in order to go to the Air Force school to train those people, I think for a 6-month or a year training program, you had to be a staff sergeant or better. So all of the guys in the Air Force who had that as their AFSC were all non-commissioned officers. I was an airman third class, but I got they gave me the AFSC.
So did they have to promote you as
No,
a result?
well, they didn't go that far. They could have, and probably when I look back on it now, they probably should have. It would have been the only fair thing to do. I mean, at least make me a sergeant if they wouldn't make me a second lieutenant. Anyway, so I could very well have been the only airman third class in the whole Air Force who had that particular AFSC. The next thing they did with the 5 of us was they really got rid of us. They sent all 5 of us overseas. All 5, interestingly, in different parts of the world. One went to Korea, one went to Japan, one went to Alaska, which was considered overseas. One went to France, and I went to Germany. Which was probably the best place to go. But of the 5. The animal husbandry majors, by the way, got to be veterinary assistants. I don't know if you know it, but there's a vet on most military bases because there are animals on bases. And sometimes. And anyway, so they were assigned as vet. But I was assigned as a manpower management specialist.
So before you go on,
So I did a very logical thing, by the way. When they announced to me that I was going to Germany, they also told me that because you're going overseas, you get 2 weeks of pre-embarkation leave. I'd been in the Air Force at that point, about 5 weeks, I guess. And they're going to give me 2 weeks of leave. You didn't tell me it would count to my annual leave as part of my annual leave, but okay. So I called up my fiance and I said, guess what? I'm going to Germany for 2 years. And we were scheduled to get married in a year. I said, you want to get married now? And come to Germany? Or do you want to wait a year and we won't be able to see each other for the year and whatnot? She said, are you drunk? She said, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm guarding a prisoner. I'm in a phone booth. There were phone booths in those days. I'm in a phone booth calling you. Well, where's the prisoner? He's waiting for me outside the phone booth. Well, he wasn't going anywhere. He was going to get discharged. Anyway, so we get through this conversation. So this is, by the way, about 6 o'clock in the morning. This is all happening. And so she says, yes, I'm coming. So she wakes up her parents and says, guess what? I'm getting married. And there's a whole story. I don't think I want to put this in. It goes with the wedding, because this all had to be done in 2 weeks and whatnot. And, well, maybe it's a good side story, I guess. You'll like it.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else will. She announces that she wants to get married. We have 2 weeks in which, well, it happened to be just before Labor Day weekend. So we also, in addition to the leave time, we had Labor Day weekend before we actually had about three weeks time before I started my leave. I get off the base and whatnot. So, well, you can't get married that fast. She had always dreamed of her wedding and what it was going to be like. And when she was a little girl, her father owned a little store that sold, it was the Catskill Mountains, by the way. They sold newspapers, magazines. They had a soda fountain. Novelties, toys, stuff that tourists in the Catskills, tourists in the summer needed, all that kind of stuff. And when she was a little kid, part of her work was she sat outside the store with the piles of newspapers to make sure that people put money in the coffee can when they took a nickel in, when they took a newspaper. And she would sit there and she would read magazines, and she loved to read Bride magazines, and she had already picked out her bridal gown designer when she was 10 years old. And she had it all planned. Well, didn't look like that was going to happen, her big wedding, except that's what she wanted. So she sat down with her parents and my parents and me, and they said, well, you can't have your wedding that you want. And she said, I want my wedding. And they said, you can't do it. It's impossible. You can't do that in 2 weeks. She said, I want my wedding. So it turned out you could.
Wow.
Well, at one time, in one place, it was possible to do this. Why? Because she lived in the Catskill Mountains in Liberty, New York, which was the heart of the Catskills and what was called the Borscht Belt in those days. And there were all these hotels, and it was after Labor Day, but it was before the Jewish high holidays, which were about 2 or 3 weeks away. So the hotels had no guests because everybody would go home after Labor Day, but people came back to some of the big hotels for the high holidays because they had services at the hotels. Hotels had rabbis on staff who observed the kosher process and did religious services. So the hotels had staff. It turned out there was one synagogue in Liberty, New York. It was Orthodox. Her family belonged to it. She was raised in it. There was one rabbi. And lo and behold, one of her best friends had planned that particular day that we wanted our wedding. That was her wedding, but she'd planned it a year ago, and the rabbi was occupied. So we couldn't get the rabbi from her temple. So anyway, she puts together, we went to one of the hotels, the Pines Hotel in Fallsburg, New York. They had their staff. They were delighted. They had nothing to do.
Right.
They were sure they'll put on a wedding. They were excited, really great. So her girlfriend, who had half the band from Grossinger's Hotel, which is the big hotel, so we got the other half. And we got the rabbi from the Concord Hotel to perform the wedding. And the Pines Hotel provided everything else. So we had a wedding with 250 people within 2 weeks. And she had always dreamed of a wedding gown from a designer called Murray Hamburger and in New York. So she goes to New York and goes to Murray Hamburger Studios. The receptionist says, "Can I help you?" She says, "Yes, I'd like to speak to Mr. Hamburger." She said, "Who are you?" We gave her name. She said, "Well," she said, "what do you want to talk to her?" She said, "Well, I want one of his gowns for my wedding in 2 weeks." And she says, "Well, we don't sell wedding gowns. It's a wholesale place. We sell to stores that buy our wedding gowns, and they're all custom made, and you can't get them in 2 weeks." And she says, "Can I speak to Mr. Hamburger?" She's practically in tears, of course. And so finally, okay, Mr. Hamburger comes out and says, "What can I do for you?" So she tells her, he says, "Okay."
Wow.
He says, "But you can't try anything on. But they have models. So we'll model, you pick out a few designs, and we'll model them for you, and you can look at them and pick what you want." So they do, and she picks out one. Okay, what size? So they measure her, and that's it. He says, "You realize this is just before Labor Day weekend. We're shutting down for the weekend, so no work is going to be done, for a while. It's going to be the last second your gown is going to go." And he says, "By the way," he says, "what about your bridesmaids and such?" And she says, "Well, no, I don't need anything for them, but my mother and my sister will need, who's standing up for me, will need," okay, "send them up." We'll do that too. So they get they get their gowns, their dresses measured and whatnot. So, so we get to the day of the wedding, or the day before the wedding. Gown still isn't there. So he called New York, and yes, well, they're in the Catskill Mountains, and this is the days when shipping is not what there was no Amazon.
No.
Let's say next day delivery kind of thing. They had shipped the gowns from New York. Liberty's about 75 or 80 miles from New York. They'd shipped it on the bus. There's a bus line called the Short Line bus line that ran up to the Catskills. And anyway, but it hadn't arrived.
Uh-oh.
And it should have. And so they started calling the bus line, and they found that, yes, they were at the bus station in a town about halfway between. So her father had to go down and pick up the stuff. Then they had to be fitted. So they had kept the town tailor at midnight stitching up the gowns and whatnot. And the next day, we had our wedding.
Oh, that's a wonderful story.
So we did what the next illogical thing. We took a honeymoon because I still had a few days left before I had to report to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, to get on a troop ship to go overseas. So we had 5 days, and we went to Bermuda for our honeymoon and came back. And when I came back, and I happened to look at my leave orders, and it says I was not allowed to leave the United States, I found out I had been AWOL for 5 days. But the Air Force, we won't tell them now, will we?
Right, just at this point. No.
But anyway, so then I reported into to Camp Kilmer and had to hang around there for pre-embarkation.
I'm sorry.
And
so was your wife with you?
Yeah, my new wife, my brand new wife, my bride.
Yeah.
Fortunately, her college roommate lived in a town just near the camp, so she came down and stayed with her roommate family. We could see each other when I was off duty until I got on the ship and waved goodbye. And then I didn't see my bride until just before Thanksgiving, and this was the end of September.
Oh my! Wow! Oh my goodness!
So that was my beginning days in the military.
right before you go into troops.
Yeah.
So
troop trip, by the way, was an experience too.
How so?
It was 10 days crossing the Atlantic, and I was on E deck, way down, and they would let you up on the top deck to breathe fresh air about an hour every day, because they had 2,000 troops on the ship, and so they rotated people, and you were in this deck. You were in a hold, actually stacked 4 high on what were stretchers, really, so that they folded up and they folded down to lie on them, and then you were stacked. And so once you got in and the guy above you got in, you couldn't get out.
That was it.
And as he rolled around, you had to roll around too. And it happened that the mess hall was on our E deck.
Oh.
So they started serving breakfast at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and they served breakfast up until about 8 o'clock in the morning, and the people lined up constant. It was a constant line that never ended. And then as soon as they finished breakfast, they started lunch. So the line kept going, and the smell of cooking was constant for 10 days. not a fun experience.
Were you seasick?
Yes, everybody was.
Wow.
Yeah, that was no fun.
No. Wow. So, is your first stop in Germany at the Zimbach Air Base?
Well, my first stop was Bremerhaven, where the Army had their both their port of embarkation and their port of debarkation. And I was there, I think, just overnight, and they gave me a train ticket and put me on a train that was headed in the right direction, and I had to find my way to Kaiserslautern, Germany, which was near Sembach Air Base. And somebody, I think, met me at the railroad station, and I was taken to the base, and that's it. Yeah.
So, just a few things. One of them is you had mentioned earlier that when you were re-enlistee, you were with a lot of other people other than college students, aside from the four whom you had mentioned. So, was this the first time that you met people from different walks of life or different parts of the country?
The basic training base was really, that way. And then, this was... The Air Force did not have a lot of enlisted men with college degrees because of the 4-year enlistment requirement. Pretty much, guys who enlisted the Air Force were guys who either hadn't graduated from college, high school, or had just graduated from high school and weren't going to college for whatever reason, and joined the Air Force for 4 years. They were mostly 18-year-old. Most of the largest body were 18-year-olds who got to be 22 while they were in the Air Force in the 4-year period. But relatively few. In fact, I think there were about 2,000 people on the base that I was on, Sembach, and to the best of my knowledge, there were maybe half a dozen college graduate enlisted men, and most of them had jobs that were clerk typists or working in the finance office or headquarters of one. I worked in manpower management, came under the general heading of personnel, so I was assigned to the wing headquarters and personnel section, which probably had, let's say, as far as the enlisted personnel were concerned, probably had the guys who could read, write, and type, at least, as opposed to, a lot of people in the military do pretty menial labor, and that's their bodies is really what they are. Yeah. And if you were in the wing headquarters squadron, they were generally, I would say, not totally the average Air Force enlisted personnel, but maybe even educationally, or at least, they had better jobs than most of the others.
Well, were you meeting African Americans, like in that the integration happened in 1948?
That's an interesting thing. The Air Force was very white in those days, very white. There were very few African American Air Force personnel on the base, and at wing headquarters level, probably a lower percentage than the average for the base. It was prejudice. Yeah. Pure and simple. It was.
Yeah. Did you meet any other Jewish people in?
No.
No.
The extent, there was one other guy who was actually the same boat I was. He'd gone to Boston University, and in fact, he too was married. Well, that was another thing about my situation. Once my wife arrived in November, I no longer lived on the base, so I didn't, I didn't hang out with my fellow enlisted men. I did until she was there in the barrack. But even we were in Germany, post-war Germany, and the military situation on the base. Our barracks, quote unquote, was like a college dormitory. It was 2 men to a room with closets. It was nicer than my dorm room. Really was on each floor of I think the barrack was 3 or 4 stories, and there was your showers rooms were really nice, and you actually had cubicles for showering, and there was a day room on each floor with ping pong tables and pool tables, and we didn't have TV, but you had, lounge chairs and reading areas and whatnot. And, because the military in Germany, and that's why Germany was a good place to be stationed, in the 50s, we were still the occupation forces in Germany.
Yeah.
And they built bases that were luxurious. There was dependent housing. If you were eligible for housing, an officer or a non-com, you got an apartment that had 1 more bedroom than you had children.
Oh, my goodness.
In other words, if you were just a couple, you got a 2-bedroom apartment. If you had 1 child, you got a 3-bedroom apartment. And the apartments buildings near us, there was first of all, the Kaiserslautern area. The Kaiserslautern area, the town had probably about a German population of about 15,000. There were 20,000 American military independents living there. It was little America, it really was. And the dependent housing had a high school, a grammar school, a library. The PX was the department store. The commissary was like a huge supermarket, not quite Mariano's, but but really had everything available. I mean, when you went to the PX, there was a separate barber shop, a separate they call it a Class 6 store, a liquor store. It was all. It was like living in America, except better for the military, for most of the enlisted military, and even the officers. Their lifestyle was much better. There was an officers' club at Vogelweh, which was the housing area that cost over $1 million to build. There was a congressional investigation after that, but the congressman came over, enjoyed the club, never did anything about it. But that's the way it was.
So where did you and your wife?
Huh?
Where did you and your wife live?
No, that was unfortunate. I was an E2 later, in E3. So I was not eligible for this luxurious housing and such. So my wife came over and we lived at what was called on the economy. On the economy, Sembach Air Base was next to the town of Sembach. Was virtually just a bunch of farms. And the next town over was a town called Enkenbach. And that's where most of the married lower rank enlisted men lived with their wives, and we lived in German families' homes. We rented rooms in their homes. So we had 2 rooms in a German family's home. We were the first people, Americans, that they had living with them. Sure. They did it for the income from our magnificent $35 a month, which was a big chunk of my Airman Third Class pay, by the way, which totaled with all my separate rations because I was not eating at the base. And my wife, not me, my wife got what they called a Class Q allotment, which was given to your quarters, Class Q, for your rent or whatever. It didn't go to you, it went to your wife. But anyway, the whole total came to about $180 a month. So that's $35, for which we had to do buy our own food as well as pay rent and everything else.
Yeah.
And whatnot. So we had these 2 rooms. They had coal stoves in them for heat individually. You had to keep a fire going in this coal stove with charcoal briquettes. We lived over a bakery, and our landlord was a baker. Oh. So we had the good fortune of having hot water because he had built tanks into his baker's oven, and they kept the fire going in the oven all the time because it was too expensive to start it all the time. They burn charcoal again. But we had an outhouse, no indoor plumbing. And we had a sink. I'm looking for something to compare it with inside. Nothing. It's a little smaller than this table.
Just a little small.
That was our kitchen sink, our bathroom sink, our laundry sink, everything sink. Of course, no television. The only radio, we had a little tiny portable radio, and you could get the only English-speaking radio was Armed Forces Network. Our news came from Stars and Stripes. I will say it was both were a little biased, but that was our life.
Wow.
And our neighbors in pretty much were young couples, and this was an interesting sociological situation. These were 18-year-old guys who got in the Air Force. A huge percentage of the enlisted force in the Air Force came from the South and the Southwest. Why Air Force? Because most of the Air Force bases were in the South and Southwest because there were more flying days available for training purposes in the South and Southwest. And that's what became the favorite place for guys who were enlisting in the service, as opposed to the Army, who also got a lot of people, enlisted personnel from the South, but not as many as the Air Force. So these guys would tend to marry girls from the town near the air base, or who were maybe 16 or 17. Luckily, they were 18, maybe, and their lifestyle was a little different than ours.
Yeah.
So we didn't have a lot of social life in town, we'll say, with a lot of these people. I will tell you a story. This will shock Ken, I'm sure. Maybe not you. They were nice people. I mean, they were nice. So after, and my poor wife, by the way, sideline, the military, at least the Air Force, would not hire the wives of the military personnel for the most part for secretarial, teaching jobs, librarians on the base, those sort of jobs. They hired Germans exclusively on the base for these jobs because they were paying them. And that had to do with, by the way, all this housing and all this great stuff was called Deutschmark funds. These were the reparation funds that the Germans had to pay the Americans for World War II.
Oh.
After World War I, the reparations that the Germans had to pay were so severe that it bankrupted Germany. Thus, you got a guy by the name of Hitler.
Well, I think
this is all connected.
I thought after World War II, there was the Marshall Plan.
Yeah, but that was later. The Marshall Plan had more to do with relief funds.
I see.
But it was part of the same thinking. Okay. After World War I, they realized that the reparations literally resulted in the rise of Adolf Hitler and all that went with it. So after World War II, they decided, at least the Americans did, and the French and the British and the Russians may not have bought all the same stuff the Americans did. The Americans said, what we will do is we will have these reparations funds, but we will invest them in the German economy. We'll use those funds to build and supply our military bases in Germany. So that's what they did. So that's why all the luxury was there, because they were playing with monopoly money, as far as they were concerned.
Yeah.
And also employing personnel. This meant that my wife, my dear wife, who had 3 years of college behind her in elementary education and who wanted to be a teacher, couldn't work on the base, had nothing to do, was stuck in a little town with no car or anything, and no transportation, with some very nice girls who she didn't have a whole lot in common with.
Yeah.
And it was really tougher on her than it was me, because I'd go off in the morning to the base. I live on this nice base with its nice facilities and no outhouse. I had plumbing. She didn't. And such a heat. She could never keep the fires going. And it was very tough on her. Anyway, to go back to where I was. So three of these young ladies came to call on my wife and welcome her to Ankenbach. And one of them brought a can of peas. One of them brought something else. I don't know. They came, and they sat, and they had coffee together with her. And it was November. And I don't know how the subject came up, but they said something about, well, you'll be getting ready for Christmas pretty soon, to my wife. And my wife says, well, I don't celebrate Christmas. I'm Jewish. And one of them looked at her and said, you are? She said, where are your horns?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
I mean,
yeah.
That's a
They
fact.
really expected. Yeah.
That's a fact. So, that was a good example of our life. So we were there. There were almost no Jewish personnel, except there was a JAG officer who was really like he was out of law school and went in for his couple of years. There was this other guy who was in the same boat as I was. There were a few others there, and we got to meet each other. We found out that there was no Air Force Jewish chaplain. There was one someplace in Germany, but he covered pretty much the whole country. But there was a chapel on the base, but it had a Catholic chaplain and a Protestant chaplain. But at Vogelway, which was the housing area, that was all Army run, and they had a Jewish chaplain who was stationed there, and they had services.
Was this Rabbi Dreyfus?
Yes, family
who you
Dreyfus.
mentioned?
Yeah. When we got there, yes. So somebody told us about services there. I don't remember who it was. So one Friday night we went to services and met a few. There were very few young Jewish couples. There were a few career people who were Jewish. Not too many, but a few. There were a few dentists and doctors who were drafted but were officers, and a smattering of people like guys like us who were in the Army but were married and were young and had their wives. A few who were older. We had a couple of lawyers who were enlisted men. They didn't go into JAG, who we were friendly with and whatnot. So that became our social life on weekends. Had a big effect on our lives from there on in religiously. That is not simply because we became accustomed, where I was not accustomed to going to services regularly. And my wife, even though she grew up in an Orthodox community, there wasn't a lot for girls in that situation, although she did have the first bat mitzvah that ever in that Orthodox.
That's impressive.
But we'll skip that story. Anyway.
But
so that's where we met the Dreyfuses.
So that's interesting. So in a way, so you got into the habit of going regularly to Shabbat services.
They had a little boy, the 2-year-old, Jimmy. Had an incident, by the way, about being Jewish. We lived with this Jewish family in a little town in Germany. My wife was...
The first place?
No, in Germany. I said, we were living in this little town of Enkenbach.
Yes.
And nobody spoke English in the town, by the way. My wife, whose grandmother lived with her family until my wife was 12, until her grandmother died. Her grandmother didn't speak English, she spoke Yiddish. And my wife didn't speak it, but she understood Yiddish, which is close to German in many ways. So she could get by in town when she had to go shopping for food. The butcher and of course we lived over a bakery, so the bakery was a given. And talking to the landlord and that sort of people in town. But she also, when she was out and about walking around town, she would see the young German guys, the teenagers, older teenagers, 18, 19. These were kids that grew up in the Hitler Youth.
Yeah.
They had been indoctrinated. Believe me, she was scared to death by these kids. Nobody ever did anything, but there was never anything. But anyway, my point is, we never made any announcements that we were Jewish to our landlord and landlady, who were very sweet, nice people. And we got along with them, still communicate with their daughter.
To this day.
And they looked at it, they didn't, we were Americans, as far as we were Americans, they didn't have religions, or they were just Americans.
Kids, right? So it wasn't a question.
And so we were completely, accepted as Americans, and we paid rent regularly. But they were nice and everything. So we never said anything to them about being Jewish. When we were off duty in Germany, the military urged us to wear civilian clothes. And they even had dress regulations. It was not, not just clothes, but
prescribed.
Well, but this was the 50s, and I'd gone to college wearing coat and tie and, khaki pants and white bucks, but a striped tie and a button-down shirt and whatnot. So that's what my off-duty uniform was, too, and people. So one day our town was right near the Autobahn, and occasionally the Dreyfuses would come visit us with their little boy Jimmy, and we would go to dinner together or something. We couldn't have dinner in our little apartment. It was impossible. We had a 2-burner hot plate for cooking. So anyway, we go to the local guest house, which is a tavern, and have dinner with them here and there. So one day, and Stanley was always in civilian clothes like I was. One day, he had to go someplace on official duty, and he had to drive. So he took his wife and son along with him, and they went to where they were going. They finished up. They're on their way home, and in order to get home, they were on the Autobahn, and they had to pass by our town, and it was about 5 o'clock in the evening, and they said to each other, well, let's stop and see if the Lebowitzes want to have dinner with us someplace. So we stopped, and he was in uniform. He's a Jewish chaplain. So in order to get to our apartment, they had to go into the landlady's kitchen and go up the stairs to our apartment. So and the landlady had met them before, Helen Frau Dreyfus, and the little boy, and she always fussed over the little boy, and who was my rheumatologist, by the way, these days. So he just retired, as a matter of fact. Anyway, so they come in, and the landlady greets them and talks to them, and Stanley is in uniform. Well, a Jewish chaplain, normally a chaplain in the military, on his lapels, they have a cross. But a Jewish chaplain has the 10 Commandments on his lapels. I could give a lecture on that, by the way, subject. Why the 10 Commandments? Why the military thought that the 10 Commandments would be there, but that's another story. Anyway, so she puts 2 and 2 together somehow and realizes. So anyway, they come up to our apartment, preparation to our going out to dinner, and Jimmy, their little boy who's 2 years old, announced to his mommy, I want to go potty. And she was in this potty training routine at this point, and she was not going to miss the opportunity. So even though it meant going to the outhouse, which meant that she had to go down through the landlady's kitchen, out through the bakery, out through the outhouse, which she does, and comes back with him. On her way back, our landlady stops her, and she's in tears, and she's crying. And she's saying, Frau Rabina, and this is all in German. Marianne Dreyfus was born in Germany. Grew up, she was on the Kindertransport, as a matter of fact. And her grandfather was Leo Beck. She made it a point never to speak German in the time she was in Germany. But she understood it.
Yeah.
So the landlady's crying and telling her, how sorry she was. her they had her husband's a baker, and they bought their flour every day from a miller in the next town, Sembach. It was where the flour mill. They were Jewish. The family was Jewish, the miller. And they said one day he went to get the flour, and they were gone. Nobody knew. You know, it's the story you heard over and over again from it. So from then on, at least our landlord and landlady knew we were Jewish, but nothing was ever, they still were the same. Nice, but
If anything, it sounds
this is interesting.
apologetic.
This is interesting because the town itself, population of the town itself, was about 50-50 Catholic and Protestant. But the Protestants were, during World War II, were more or less in charge. In fact, while the Burgermeister, the mayor, was Protestant, and the Catholics suffered. There was a real
divide.
It's like the Democrats and the Republicans today. I mean, that's not rational.
No.
But there was this divide in the town. Our landlord and landlady were Catholic. Well, the landlord, during World War II, he was a cook in the army, and he was on the Russian front. They didn't hear from him for years. They didn't know whether he was alive or dead. They had their problems. He couldn't. I mean, he's the baker, and the bakery could operate, but hardly, because she couldn't do all the work herself, and they suffered. So anyway, our relationship with them was always great.
Yeah.
And wonderful. We never really ran into a lot, but I always said there were two German men I never met in Germany. I never met a German who said he fought the Americans. They all said they fought on the Russian front. Now we were in the extreme western part of Germany, and why Hitler decided to take all these guys from the west and have them fight in the east, I don't know. But the other one was, I never fought a German who knew what happened to the Jews during the war. They just disappeared, and they didn't know anything about it. But that was being in the service as a Jew during the war, after the war, World War II, is part of the deal.
How did Rabbi Dreyfus, your friend, and his wife in general experience being in Germany?
Well, I told you what Marianne said. I mean, she didn't hate Germans. They too lived on the economy, actually, for a while, until their housing was ready for them when they got there. So they had a taste of it. All their quarters were better than ours. Not quite as primitive, at any rate. But no, they did. I have a picture that I'll share with you of the Dreyfuses and Jimmy and my wife and I and his chaplain's assistant, who also has been a lifelong friend of ours. We were in Heidelberg. There was a thing called the JWB, the Jewish Welfare Board, which was its purpose was to serve Jewish military. Started during World War II,
Right.
and continued post-war. I think it continues today to a certain extent, but not very much. Anyway, they had what a large house, or rented it in Heidelberg, where they had a center for Jewish military personnel. You could come there on the weekend and get lox and bagels on the Saturday, and they had a thing where you could make a record phonograph record to send home to your family, because you realize this is 1954 to 56. We didn't have a phone. Calling to the States was a big deal.
Yeah.
You had to go to the post office. You had to make a reservation for a time and set up an appointment, and you had the time difference between the States and Germany to deal with if you wanted to call, and it cost a fortune, especially what I was earning. So literally, we never spoke to our parents for 2 years. But we did send them a couple of recordings and a lot of pictures. And my wife wrote letters and got letters back with what they called airograms.
Yeah.
That folded up. You could go airmail, which only took 3 weeks to get there and whatnot. So anyway, you'd go to the JWB, and also they would take pictures. And this happened to be Hanukkah, I think, at this time. And anyways, the 5 of us at the JWB, and I'll send you that picture. So
that'd be great.
It's on my phone now, but I won't take the time to show it to you. But that was a big deal. But other than that, it was Friday night services, and so we would spend our weekends pretty much with the Dreyfuses, and they had, of course, government housing, a beautiful apartment. So we would come to visit them, and we'd walk in and we'd have our towels over our arm, and we would say hello and disappear into the bathroom and take showers, real showers, and shower, and then we sit down and start our weekend. And we commute back and forth.
So would you guys celebrate holidays like Passover?
In fact, one of the photos I will send you. Now this, by the way, talk about the services for a minute. There were, among the wives, the couples that came regularly to services, it was basically the few young enlisted guys like me and a couple of our good friends. Most of the career people did not come, and nor did the officers who were there by virtue of occupation, the JAGs and the dentists and the doctors and such. They'd come for the high holiday services. You'd see them then, and occasionally on the other holidays. If they bring the kids for Hanukkah, because these people some of the career people had kids, which presented problems to them sometimes that growing up. But anyway, services, the wives had a function. They had a couple of functions. First of all, they would bake cakes for after services.
Nice.
For the Onig Shabbat.
Yeah.
They were also young Jewish girls. The fact that they were married and often pregnant.
Not sure.
Very pregnant. We had a baby too in Germany. And it wasn't much to do at night. Anyway, the young GIs that were there would come to services, and I used to constantly kid Rabbi Dreyfus. I said, "Do you think they come for your sermons?" And they come because they get a piece of homemade cake and they get to talk to a nice Jewish girl for a while. Doesn't marry. She's married.
But just happy to have a nice conversation with
a lot of these guys, they were, mostly 18, 19, 20-year-old young guys. other guys on the base, they would go to bars or hang out. They would date German girls. These guys would not date German girls at all, and
They were lonely.
they're human. They're 18-year-olds. So anyway, so I say the wives had a function, which they did very well. And anyway, that was that was our life. That was
Interesting. Did you happen to meet any Holocaust survivors who had been in DP camps in Germany?
No, I'm trying to think. We met Holocaust survivors, and probably they were. We didn't have much to do with them. I'll tell you when we saw them. Passover. We would have a community service Seder, actually at the officers, this $1 Million Officers Club, because it was the only facility that was available to us, and they did it. It didn't matter if you were an officer enlisted. We would be in civilian clothes anyway, usually for the Seder, excuse me. So they would show up for the Seders. But these people, not all of them, as far as we could tell, but many of them were, let's say, a little unsavory.
Yeah.
They ran the bars and what we called B-girls, who operated out of the bars in the area around the bases. And, well, we didn't have anything to do with them.
Yeah.
So, no, I imagine that, although they never talked about it, the chaplains probably had contact with people and had, helped them. I know they helped them. A current friend of ours who was, in fact, he passed away last year, Rabbi Walco, who was a rabbi out in Homewood, and has been a friend of ours, although he's never been our rabbi, but we were very close friends for 50 years or so. In fact, his wife just moved into Montgomery Place where we live, because we're there primarily. Anyway, his widow. And anyway, he was a chaplain in France a few years after us. And I know from his talk that, with the civilian population, he had contact with them. I mean, for instance, they would get stuff. JWB would send cases and cases of matzo ball soup and, and Passover matzahs and all that stuff to them. And they would distribute it to the civilian German Jewish population. Sure. Yeah. But we ourselves didn't have much contact.
Just wasn't that opportunity. Yeah.
I have allergies.
Oh, that's okay. Do you want to clean?
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
No, but I will take some water.
So going back to your, I forgot the Air Force term, the AFSC, as a manpower management specialist.
Yeah, that's me.
What did you do? Like, what were your duties and responsibilities?
Okay, that was interesting. When I got to Semba, there was, as I said, we were under the personnel department wing of the headquarters, the wing headquarters, the base headquarters, really. And we had an office. And the manpower management officer who was in charge, the captain, he was a pilot. Now, in the Air Force, pilots in the Air Force, if you were a rated pilot, you had to fly a certain number of hours every month in order to keep your rating. But if you were not in an active fighter squadron where you were constantly flying missions, practice missions, but you were a rated pilot, you had another job on the that you may or may not have been trained for, but by virtue of being an officer, you were considered qualified for. So my boss was this captain who was both the manpower management officer and the ground safety officer. The Air Force has two kinds of safety, ground and air.
Sure.
They separate them. You know which one is more important. Anyway, that was his job, which basically meant he supervised the office most of the time. He was an interesting guy, a very nice guy. He really was. But he was a fly boy. I mean, all he wanted to be all his life was a pilot, and he could care less about being the manpower management officer or the ground safety officer. He said, "You guys run it. I'm here. I'll sign the papers. You have fun." And then there was a master sergeant who was the NCO in charge, and me, and another guy who was a clerk typist. That was his job, and because it was also the same physical office was ground safety, there was a German ground safety engineer that they hired, who was an engineer, and he did all the ground safety work stuff. Harold Pullman, very nice man. Anyway, so basically, the master sergeant was really my boss, and he himself, it was interesting in that he'd been in the Army when it was the Army and the Air Force were almost all of the career people had originally been Army people who were Air Corps that became Air Force at that point. In fact, some people still wore the Army khakis rather than the blues because they hadn't worn them out yet. So it was still a little mixed in the early 50s. Anyway, he had gotten out of the service. I guess he was a master sergeant, and he'd gotten out, and at some point in civilian life, he'd been out for a few years, he developed ulcers, but it was not service related, I guess. At any rate, he was having trouble medically and also economically. So somehow or other, he managed to get back in the Air Force, and they sent him to this manpower management school because he was a master sergeant. So his total education in the field was what he learned, and he was even sort of not wholeheartedly military. He was there mostly because he was safer there medically and economically than he was in civilian life. A very nice guy. I was an airman third class. He was a master sergeant, but it was Bob and Dave. That was the way it was.
So were you involved in were you involved in personnel, like making sure people's, if they were looking for certain
Well, that was part of my job. They had, I don't know how the Army did. The Air Force had what they called UMDs, Unit Manning Documents, that were set up someplace in Air Force heaven, describing all the jobs in a particular unit. What a squadron had to have, depending upon what their job was. Ours was reconnaissance, so we had people that operated cameras, and we had what they called a recce tech, a reconnaissance technical unit that did all the developing and such of the films. Well, every Air Force unit didn't have that stuff, but we did. So you had to have people, make sure that you had the right people assigned to the right technical stuff that you had to have done and all. And that was all done. So all these documents, UMDs, were sort of, the only people that ever looked at them were people in the manpower management office. But the Air Force also had a secondary thing. They wanted Air Force officers and senior enlisted men to have some kind of management training. These people are managers. That's their job. That's why they got to be officers and non-coms. But typically in the military, they were trained in a lot of things, but they weren't trained in management. I don't know if even West Point trained people in management. So the Air Force said, what we want to do is have what they called a base level, an air base level management training program, 6-week program to try to give people some basic ideas in how to manage, for better or worse. That's what it was. So the goal was ultimately to train every officer and every senior non-commissioned officer on a base. So they look, well, how are we going to do this? Oh, we got a thing called manpower management. And we have these guys that are called manpower management specialists. And we have manpower management officers. Of course, among the officers, basically they got to be manpower management officers in the Air Force because they flew airplanes. And they were no more qualified at that than they were better qualified at flying airplanes, let's say. But so that left it to the non-coms who had gone to the school who had that. And this one guy who had 4 years that was the major in college. So somebody had to run the school.
Looks like you.
So that was me. Because, well, theoretically, until I got there, actually, the master sergeant was in charge of the school. And when I walked in the door, his eyes lit up. Because he didn't want to do that in the worst way. He was okay playing with the documents, but he didn't want to teach the school. First of all, it upset his ulcers. The guy used to sit there with a carton of milk on his desk. Nobody had told him yet that milk doesn't cure ulcers. But in those days, I guess it did. But anyway, that was my assignment, mostly. I also got to do stuff, the other stuff, detailed stuff when I wasn't teaching. So every day I had a class of officers and a class of non-coms that I taught Air Force management methods. So
did you design?
My first class was funny. I think I had 2 lieutenant colonels, 3 majors, and a few captains, all career military people. Honestly, they had more time in the Air Force than I had been alive. I was 22 years old, and I'm teaching them Air Force management methods.
Oh my! How did that go over?
And I'm an airman 3rd class. I'm about as low as you get, because once you get through with basic training, you become an airman 3rd class. So it was an interesting situation, but it went well for a couple of reasons. First of all, this was something that not all of them, most of them felt, well, it's good stuff. A, to learn, and B, to have in my record that I was trained in management methods.
Yeah.
Why not? Brownie points for it. But there was something else that I incorporated into the class, because the Air Force had gotten big on trying to get people to improve, make suggestions to improve whatever work they did, no matter who you were, what rank you were, make your job better and find ways to do it and write it up and do it. So at the first day of class, and what they had this form that you filled out to make your job better. I forget what they call it. And they offered every month on each base, they would have a group judge the submissions. Everybody didn't submit, but anybody who submitted a form, and they would award cash prizes to the best of them. Then they would take the best of them and they would send them to the next higher level.
Oh.
In our case was 12th Air Force was above our base. So we'll go to 12th Air Force where they would pick the best of those and they would get a really nice cash reward. And then they would take the best of those and they would go to headquarters USAFE in Europe.
Wow.
And the same process. And from those, it would go to Washington, to headquarters of the United States Air Force, and the whole process. And those cash prices got into the thousands and thousands of dollars and whatnot. So it was like the lottery. You know? So the first day of the course, I would pass out the forms. I said, what you're going to do is what you learn here. We want you to apply the methods you're learning here to whatever your job is. And using that, what you learn, figure out a way to fill out one of these forms to improve your job and submit the form. That's your final exam, is to submit the form. You got to submit it to me. I will submit it to the... So everybody did. By the time I was through with 2 or 3 rounds of courses, it turned out that my students won all the prizes on the base.
Well, that's wonderful.
And some people won prizes at the next level. And some people, I had 2 guys who got all the way to the Air Force.
Well, that's level. Really wonderful.
They won money. So I made friends. and one of the nice things to have in the military is friends in high places. And everybody was in a higher place than me. So if I needed something, whatever, I knew somebody and I could get it. Like, for instance, we'd moved, we had a baby. Before we had the baby, I guess. My mother-in-law, my wife, had been cooking on this 2-burner hot plate for a couple of months, and she hated it because if she had meat, the only thing she did was fry it.
Yeah.
She hated frying food. Yeah. She didn't grow up that way. It had to be broiled or boiled or but you never fried stuff. So her mother sent over what they called a Hollywood broiler, an electric broiler that looked like one of these serving dome things that, you put on the table, except that it was a heating element in the top of it that you broil that way. Great. wonderful, except it was 110 in the States and it was 220 in Germany. And my little transformer that we used for little stuff like our radio and things like that wouldn't do for this broiler. I needed a big transformer. And we had transformers all over the base because we had a lot of American equipment that was 110 and the electricity on the base was 220. So I called the master sergeant, who was the head honcho at the supply on the base. Sarge, one of my students, Sarge, I need a transformer. He says, what's your address in town? I'll have somebody drop it off.
Wow.
He said, drop the transformer. I plugged it in and blew out half the lights in town. It was a little more than the electric system could take. So I called him up and explained it. So he sent me the appropriate size and it worked out. Then we needed blankets because those cold nights were getting to be too much. And so I needed blankets. Same thing. Called him. My ultimate boss, the personnel officer, major, says when we were Sembach, where we were stationed, was 25 miles or so from Landstuhl and Ramstein air bases. Mm-hmm. Ramstein was headquarters, 12th Air Force. So he said, the major said to me, we have to go to 12th Air Force tomorrow morning, you and me, because there's something that they want to do about manpower, and you got to be there. Okay, yes, sir. He said, get a vehicle assigned to us from the motor pool. So the motor. This is something that went on in Germany, and it related to the this idea of the Deutschmark funds that we were spending money. Every military base has vehicles. They have jeeps and they have weapons carriers, and so we did too, except for one thing. All our jeeps and our weapons carriers and our 4x and our 6x were sitting in a field up on blocks.
On blocks?
Yeah. And they had crews that did nothing all day long but go around and start them and run them and keep them active, because you had to have those in case of war. But the vehicles we used on the base were German vehicles. They were Volkswagen trucks, vans, and pickups that were like the vans cut in half. And they were pickup trucks made by Volkswagen, and we had Opel trucks and such. They weren't military serviceable vehicles, but they were paid for by Deutschmark funds. Yeah. So that's what we used. And there were 3 American cars, 2 Fords and a Buick. Of course, the base commander, who was a colonel, he had the Buick. And then the 2 Fords tend to rotate between the exec officer, who was also a bird colonel, and what they call the air base squadron, air base group. That's the unit that actually ran the physical base, that commander. So those were the 3 American vehicles. So I call the master sergeant, who's head of the motor pool. Sarge, I need a vehicle. Major so-and-so, and I have to go to 12th Air Force tomorrow. Can you get me a Volkswagen truck to drive over? And he says, oh, sure, I'll get you a vehicle. I don't know what the base commander was driving that day, but the major and I were in the Buick. So it was nice having friends around. And the interesting thing was that the relationship in class was teacher-student. As long as, I didn't say sir to the officers when and as far as they were concerned, that was fine. And it was back and forth. And, I only had trouble with one officer, and it was a WAF lieutenant. And she had an attitude. But other than that, I never had a problem about the disparity between our ranks because, I knew what they wanted to learn. And that was as simple as that.
So I was about to ask you about that side of it. Did you develop the curriculum? Like, how did you figure from your studies what to focus on?
The Air Force provided everything in terms of it. I mean, when I got the job, the sergeant handed me this pile of things, handouts, and I went through them, and I said, this is awful. And so I sent a letter to my father, and I said, can you send me such and such textbooks
that you would use?
That I'd used. He did. And I wrote my own curriculum. and they liked it a lot better. I mean, I'd pass out this stuff, and I said, you can use this for reference, but let's talk about it this way, and let's look at it. If you were running General Motors and you had to do this or that, what would you do in this case or that case? That's the way I operated it. And they liked it. So that was fun.
So the Wharton Business School came in handy after all. Your education at Wharton came in handy.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I never really got to teach again after that. It was fun.
When did you land up at the Landstuhl Air Force Base near Ramstein?
Well, I would have been happy to stay at Sembach if they would give me housing, which they couldn't do, although they might have. But the Air Force had a regulation. If you received a commission on a base, you had to be transferred off the base. Why? Because maybe there was a sergeant who treated you badly, and you were going to treat him badly when you got the opportunity. It happened that the sergeant I worked for and I were great friends. Yeah. The sergeant who was the master sergeant in charge of personnel, he was like, you're too young to remember this, but there was a TV program, Sergeant Bilko, Phil Silvers, Ken remembers it. He was Sergeant Bilko if there ever was. He was the number one operator in the Air Force, Master Sergeant. But in fact, our base, Sembach, was 25 miles from the housing area. So all the people who were eligible for housing, including him, their families were 25 miles away. Mm. They were building housing on our base. Oh. And it was being assigned as it was built, completed, military style, by rank. Oh, he's a master sergeant, but there were officers who get first call. So his family, and he had 3 kids, they're all in Vogelway, and there's housing on the base available, and he's not getting any. And he goes to the personnel officer, who was the guy, his boss is Major, who's in charge of distributing the housing. And he says, Major, I want my family over here. And the Major says, Sarge, you just have to wait, because rank has its privileges. Yeah. You're going to wait. He says, no, sir. I'm not going to wait. Either you can move my family over here or I'm leaving.
Yeah.
Now, this is a career guy. He's been in for over 20 years.
Yes.
And, well, it turns out that in his career, in his previous jobs, he was the first sergeant for a guy who is now a general in the Pentagon who is in charge of personnel in the Pentagon. And he was his first sergeant. So he contacts this general. Oh, he says, the major says, no, Sarge, you're here for 3 years. You're going to be here. Because that was what you had to be overseas if you took your dependents over. You had to stay for 3 years. And he says, no, sir. My next job is going to be First Sergeant, Headquarters, United States Air Force in the Pentagon. My gosh, about a month later, he was packed up and he was going to the Pentagon. But that's the way the military works sometimes. Anyway, where was I?
So lunch.
So they're going to transfer, they had to transfer me. It was a bit of a problem. It is now November. In my second year, and my wife is not only pregnant, she is very pregnant any day now. Except that my wife is not doing things on time. Or our baby hadn't been told that the Air Force wanted her to be born on such and such a day. And so they kept postponing my transfer. By the way, I was being transferred to a base in France.
Oh.
Someplace far away. And there was a saying in the Air Force that if you were stationed in France, you should be over 6 feet tall. Because on every Air Force base, there was at least 5 feet of mud.
Wow.
France didn't lose the war. Germany lost the war. France didn't have reparation funds.
Right.
The bases in France were not as nice as the bases in Germany. Well, they kept postponing my transfer because compassionate purposes. Till finally they ran out of time.
Oh.
And they brought somebody else into that job in France. And lo and behold, and fortunately, I never asked, but at Headquarters 12th Air Force, there was a major who had been an instructor at Penn in ROTC.
Oh, my goodness.
Major Lavin, John Lavin. And I had seen him one day. He came over to Sembach on business, and I worked in the wing headquarters, and I happened to be in the hall when he walks in. I look up. I said, Major Lavin. Yeah. Oh, Lebowitz, how are you? And he sees Airman Third Class Lebowitz, and he knew I was an ROTC graduate. So we talking, and I explained what was going on. He says, well, you want to come over to work for me? And I said, no, I got a pretty good deal here, tell you the truth. And unless you can get me government housing. And he says, I can't do that. I was still an Airman Third Class when I thought, no. Anyway, so I think, whatever it was, I think he was the one that made it happen that I went to launch school, where I was no longer going to be a teacher. Launch school was really, really in need of a manpower management officer. And they didn't want a pilot who was going to be there because he was an officer. They wanted somebody who maybe knew something about the job. That was me.
Yeah.
And I walked in, and of course, fortunately, I reported to the executive officer They were, by the way, the unit, while it's called the 501st Tactical Control Group,
aircraft
actually
control.
went under the nom de plume of Tactical Control Wing Provisional.
Oh,
There was no such thing as a tactical control in the Air Force. Meant, the things that they call air traffic controllers in civilian life. That was us.
I see.
We were the air traffic controllers for the Air Force. But in our case in Germany, we were the air traffic controllers for all of Europe,
Wow.
including a thing called the Berlin Corridor, a 3-mile wide path into Berlin that everybody had to fly in, commercial or military. We owned it. So air traffic control for us, see, in the normal Air Force, it would be just the military situation wherever there were bases, like in Texas, where there were a group, they would have an air traffic control group that would handle that. Well, they needed too many people for a group size. The next higher level is a wing. So they took 2 groups, pushed them together, and said, you are now a thing called an air traffic control wing. And they said, now somebody has to sit down and decide who does what in this thing called an air traffic control wing.
Before we go on, I just was wondering, was one of the functions also early warning, like in the event
Okay, that's also a part. Early warning and air traffic control all came under the same stuff because it all involves radar, both ways, both for control and for early warning. So the technical people were the same people. The people who were operating the equipment were not necessarily trained the same. They were trained to read the scopes, which were the pre-runner to television or whatever, like television, but for different purposes. So we operated, besides the air traffic control, we operated all of the early warning radar in Europe, from the tip of Scotland down to the tip of the boot in Italy. And we had detachments sitting usually on top of mountains with radar sets. And then what we had to do, but my office's job, was figure out how many people should be at each of these sites all over. Well, not individually. Once you had it worked backwards. You started with the radar equipment. In a typical Air Force flying squadron, you would start with the aircraft. What kind of aircraft do they have? That determines what you need in terms of mechanical personnel and flying personnel, and then support personnel. Beyond that, you build what they call the unit manning document from that. So that's what we had to do. But we had to do it. We had the information from the groups. We knew how many people we needed, pretty much, for those people sitting on the mountains. The problem was, how do we utilize the duplicate people we had who did the same jobs in 2 groups? And we didn't, if we had 50 of those people in each group doing the same job, and we put it together, did we really need 100 of them, or could we go I mean, it's the same thing in industry. When a company buys another company, they cut back because they don't need 2 people to do the same job. So that was the task. And so I come in, I walk in. Interestingly enough, the first person I report to is the wing executive officer, Major Sam Levy. And Major Sam Levy and his wife Bess are one of the few career people that I knew from Friday nights. They were very nice. Oh, by the way, we were a tenant on Landstuhl Air Base. Landstuhl Air Base was a flying base at fighter planes at that time. And the base adjutant was Captain Hyman Cohn.
So surprising number of Jews on.
Lots of them. Who I also knew, he had 2 little kids. Sam had 3 little kids. Well, Sam had a high school daughter, which was a real issue for them. Anyway, so I reported to Sam properly, of course, and he sends me to see the wing commander, Colonel Bond, and who's, by the way, one of the very few Air Force wing commanders who wasn't a rated pilot, which was really rare, but we weren't a flying unit. So, and there weren't any other wings in the Air Force like ours, because this was brand new. So he had a chip on his shoulder, by the way. But that's different. Anyway, I was warmly greeted because I was going to solve a mess. And that's what I did. I had to solve a mess. They begged me. I got there with less than a year to go as a second lieutenant.
Yeah.
And they literally begged me to stay in the Air Force.
Oh, after the second year.
After the second year. But I wouldn't. My wife certainly wouldn't.
And did you continue to live in the 2 rooms in the town?
No, well,
with your baby?
when the baby was born, we had to get to a better situation, and my income went up when I got my commission. In fact, it doubled, which was nice. And anyway, no, we found an apartment in the town, same town, because even though I was, the baby was actually born before I transferred. No, she was born after I transferred. Take that back. But we knew we were going to have a baby, and so we couldn't in those circumstances. So there was an apartment in town and a couple's house that the second floor of the house. Right after World War II, an Army officer had a German girlfriend, and he made a deal with these people that he would build out an apartment, American-style apartment on the second floor in exchange for free rent while he was there. So he built it out, and it was a 3-room apartment where the rooms were all connected, and it had an oil stove for heat, and it had hot and cold water, and indoor plumbing. So we were living in luxury by then.
So, maybe a little bit more briefly, what did you do after you decided you were going to leave the Army? And when did you become involved in doing the inactive reserve duty?
Okay. Well, immediately. I mean, it was automatic.
Oh.
They didn't ask you if you were joining. You were automatically put. But that only really meant headquarters for the reserve was in Denver, and you were in a computer someplace in Denver, and you rarely heard from them. Unfortunately, this is an interesting story. I had been at this point, we were living in Chicago. We moved to Chicago in 57. I got out of the service in 56. In 57, we moved to Chicago. We moved with 2 babies, and And a few years later, we had 3 babies, 3 kids, and we're living our lives. And I'm in the mattress business and whatnot. It's April 1961. I have a year to go in the reserves, the inactive reserves. Once in a while, I get some correspondence from them that they did something or other on paper. But the Bay of Pigs comes along, the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. President Kennedy announces that they're going to call up the reserves. About a week later, my wife calls me. I'm at work. She says, there's a special delivery letter from the Air Force here. No. I said, open this. She says, not me. You want to read it? You come home. Oh, God. You're calling up the reserve. I got three little kids. Yeah. I got a business to run. The last thing I want to do is get involved, go back in the Air Force. I got a year in the reserves left. And, oh, God, no. Oh, I go home. I open the special delivery letter. It's a copy of orders, several weeks old, promoting me from first lieutenant to captain in the Air Force Reserve.
Well, that's a relief.
All on paper, of course. Yeah. So I don't even know where my uniforms are. I don't even own them anymore. Anyway, so that was my reserve experience.
Experience of being promoted as captain.
Yeah, that was a whole experience.
I meant to ask you, but when you were in Germany, it was there the time of the establishment of the Warsaw Pact and the radar stations and all that. Did you feel a looming threat of the Cold War? Like, did you feel a concern there might be an attack?
In order to do my job, I had to have clearance to see a lot of stuff that, well, today wouldn't be classified, but was then. And it was pretty scary as to what happens if. Because we have all these detachments that are literally sitting on the Iron Curtain. I mean, these guys they're on top of a hill, and the only way down the hill is to go toward Russia or East Germany. Yeah. And we had almost regularly, we had incidents on the corridor, the Berlin corridor, where a pilot, usually civilian pilots, whose English, I remember we had an Italian plane that was in the corridor, and the guy went off course. He misunderstood an instruction. His English wasn't so good. And he went off course, and our radar is picking up MiGs, Russian MiGs, taking off to intercept. I mean, many times this would have we'd go on alert. We had I just read preparation to this. I was looking up on Google the units I was in. And, there's histories from all of this stuff someplace. You can find out anything, pretty much. And they didn't talk about the wing thing, but the group, the 2 groups that were put together, because technically the Air Force still recognized them as 2 separate groups. But they talked about our backup control. We had air traffic control that we operated. And then there was an exact duplicate of it in a hollowed out mountain near the French border.
Oh.
And we had an exact copy, double personnel there. the assumption was that the original would be wiped out, and the other one was secret. How secret? The Russians used to broadcast to the guys who were in the mountains. So I don't know how secret it really was, but there was a reference to that in the that I found online someplace. I know about it because I had to know who was there.
That's right.
Yeah.
How many people were there?
Yeah.
Is there a moment from your service that you're most proud of?
That I'm most proud of? I really can't think of anything service connected. Let me think. No, I don't think so. I can't think of anything
Offhand.
that comes to mind that I'm particularly proud of that I did. I think I'm proud of the work that I did. I think I did a good job in the jobs I was given to do. I think I gave the Air Force their money's worth.
Yeah.
But a single thing, no. I was appreciated in both cases in the jobs. I mean, there were things. This Colonel Tom Bond, who was the CO of the Tactical Control Wing, he was just nice to me. He was a tough guy, really, really tough. But he, when my wife delivered the baby at Lonsdale Army Hospital, and then she had that was a situation in itself. I mean, she all the time she was pregnant, she never saw the same doctor twice for her visits.
Yeah.
And she never actually saw an OB-GYN. She saw whatever that doctor was. He was a doctor. That was all. He could have been an orthopedist. But that's the guy she saw, and the guy she saw who delivered. She had seen before actually, and there was this whole big issue, by the way, about what if we had a boy? What would we do about a circumcision?
Sure.
We had a girl. We had the bris anyway. She had made baked in preparation. Anyway.
A celebration.
But I was going to say that one of the nicest things was Colonel Bond's wife actually came from the base 25 miles out to this little town to visit my wife.
Wow.
When she had the baby.
Wow.
That was nice.
That is really nice.
People, the military was nice. You had some strange things. Sam Levy, being the exec officer on the base, second lieutenants get a lot of additional duties. And, they're assignments that you have to have it on the unit. But so he made me mortuary officer. We didn't have a mortuary. So being a mortuary officer wasn't really a big job until one day I get a call that one of our officers' wives had decided to commit suicide.
Oh, no.
By jumping in front of a train.
Oh.
So they call for the mortuary officer to go collect the remains.
Wow.
That joke didn't turn out so good. But fortunately, the Army Quartermaster Corps actually has a mortuary division with people who know what to do.
Yeah.
And my job was to take them out to this field and point in that direction and say, "Do your duty, man."
Yeah.
And get out of there. Then he had also given me, put me on a court martial board. Yeah, we didn't have a court martial until one day we did. And I found myself on a court martial board on a murder case. There was a young man who, 18-year-old kid. We had these units all over Europe, and this was near Munich. He got into a fight in a bar, and it turned out to be a fight with knives, and a German civilian was killed, and this guy was arrested. And so they convened. We're the headquarters, so the trial is going to be at our base. They convene the court, and the court meets. And in those days, today, I may be wrong, but I think they now have enlisted men, at least non-commissioned officers, serving on court-martial boards. But in those days, only officers served on.
So an exception.
So we meet, we convene, and of course, I'm a second lieutenant. I'm the lowest-ranking officer on the board. The president of the board is a colonel, and he explains the process to all of us according to the book. And he says, "Lieutenant," he says, "under the rules, when we vote, you will vote first, so you won't be influenced by the vote of a higher-ranking officer." Go through all this thing about how fair we're going to do this and how fair we're going to do it. And he said, "Okay, are we all set to go in and do this?" He said, "Okay, bring the guilty party in."
Right.
Military justice.
How did you vote?
Well, this is okay. I'll reveal my secret vote to all these people. We go through the trial. This young man, like many of the young men in the service, in the Air Force, is from Texas. He's Mexican American. And anyway, in a court martial, the prosecutor, and the defense attorney aren't lawyers. They're just officers, which qualifies them to be a prosecutor or a defense attorney. So the only officer involved is the JAG officer, who makes sure that everything is legal.
The procedure.
The procedure is legal. So, let's face it. It's not exactly ideal for the defendant to be defended by his lawyer is a guy who isn't a lawyer. So anyway, and we go through the trial, the beginnings of the trial, we adjourn, come back into the jury or our courtroom, and the president of the court says, "Did anybody notice anything about this young man?" Most of us look at her. "No, sir. What? He said, "Well, when you go back in," he says, "observe his hands and look at that webbing between his thumb and his forefinger, and you'll see a tattoo there." And so he says, that's a gang mark from a Mexican gang. You know, this kid, he says, is involved in bad stuff. I mean, this isn't in the confines of our secret court. So anyway, we go in. On the basis of what I saw, there was a fight. It was broken up by the German police, not by the American military police. And they picked this kid as the guilty party. And nothing was ever proved. There were no real eyewitnesses that came forward and said they had statements from people there, but we didn't see anybody perfect. And I honestly thought he was not guilty. Our court found him guilty. Fortunately, these things get reviewed at higher headquarters, and I learned later, after asking questions, that we were reversed. But that's what happened.
You're
good
on
ending to
the right
this,
course.
Good ending to the story.
Yeah.
But that was that was an experience. That wasn't fun.
No. So the Pritzker Military Museum and Library is dedicated to the idea of the citizen soldier. We collect artifacts, oral histories, do exhibits of the citizen soldier. What does this term mean to you?
Well, I guess I was. I mean, I was never, ever intended to be a career military person. I never objected to the idea of serving. I expected to. It was my duty. I frankly think that everybody should serve in the military, male or female. I think the Israelis are right. I think that had I gone into the military for 2 years before I went to college, when I was about 18, I think my college experience would have been different. I think I would have been more mature in college. Probably would have had less fun. but you know, I think that the military teaches you a lot. It is, even though my experience was kind of different because of my particular circumstances, I could make it. So it still puts you in a position to meet a lot of people you never would have met otherwise in your life.
Yeah. And
learn a lot about the ways things are done, for better or worse. I mean, things like the stories I just told you, that's bad stuff. It's too bad. Yeah. It happens. Bad things happen in civilian life too. In fact, I've served on 2 different murder trial civilian juries in my lifetime, and I think that things don't go so good there either. Either it makes me think that the last thing in the world I want is to be judged by a jury of my peers, because some of my peers are not very sensible people. But you know, these are things you can learn. You can learn a lot in the military. From my wife and I both, we had a tough 2 years of early parts of our lives. On the other hand, we started our married life on our own, with absolutely no contact with family for 2 years. That was not good in terms of, especially when you have a baby and you'd love to have grandparents around and they'd love to be around.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we had to learn how to do things on our own. it was a good learning experience. We did make friends that we had lifelong. The chaplain's assistant that was in that picture that I'm going to send you, he was single when he was there. It turned out he was from Chicago. We moved to Chicago. We made contact with him, and he married, and we were at his wedding, and we've been close friends for all those years since. He just passed away last year. Last year, his wife talks to us at least once or twice a week. Today, to this day. There are others. There's a woman. I don't know if Julie Willens. She connected it all with this branch of the Pritzkers because she runs the Pritz Foundation for several of the Pritzker grandchildren.
I'm not sure.
So, her father was one of our friends in Germany. He too has passed away. The wife at the time passed away before she was born. She's the child of his second wife. But that family, we've always been close to all these years. So,
some long-lasting friendships.
Yeah, sure.
And you
so we've had these connections.
Became self-sufficient.
Yeah, and the connections begot other connections too. That was it.
Just before we conclude, what brought you to Chicago? Why did you and your wife family move
My
here?
family business. We had a factory in Connecticut and a factory in Chicago, and family businesses. That in itself is an oxymoron, family business, because the two probably don't really go well together in most cases, because families have certain goals and businesses have other goals, and they don't always blend. But my grandfather founded the family business. My father, who was a son-in-law, worked in the business and really ran the business. When my grandfather got older, there were another son-in-law and a son in the business. When my grandfather died, the son and the other son-in-law were here in Chicago running the factory that was here. My father and my grandfather were in Connecticut. So the son who was in Chicago decided he became president of the company, not by virtue of anything other than the fact that he was a son, not a son-in-law, and blood is thicker than water, and my grandfather designated in his will that he would be in charge. So so he moved to Connecticut, and in a family business, that means that somebody in the family has to move to Chicago, and that was me. So we moved, and we were in Connecticut after coming back from Germany for a year, and then we moved to Chicago.
Okay, yeah. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to add? And I'll also ask Colonel Yoshitani if there's a question that you would like to add.
He has a very, very interesting life. I'm sorry about the first 2 years of his marriage. It wasn't pleasant, but at the same time, I think that may have given you strength.
Of course. Oh, we say the same thing. It wasn't fun, but it was a part of our life where we learned a lot. And also, one thing about the military that's really good is you get a lot of time off. And we were in Europe, and we traveled. We did. We were able. My job was a 8 to 5 proposition. I had weekends off all the time, and I could travel even as an airman third class. We had no money, but I mean that was a problem. We had a little tiny Austin that got about 40 miles to the gallon And at the time, the Army had set up quartermaster gas stations all over Europe, and the military could buy gas for 15 cents a gallon. So you could drive anywhere for nothing, and we just take our loaf of bread and jug of wine. And until the baby was born, we, we traveled all over pretty much. And even when she was very pregnant, we took one trip to Italy. That was, you got 30 days of leave anyway, and you got weekends, long weekends, and you could. We happened to be stationed very near the French-German border, and we were easy driving distance to Heidelberg and Mannheim and Frankfurt and places like that. So we traveled. So
made the most of it.
That part of it was good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, thank you for your service.
I enjoyed the process.
And thank you, and thank you for sharing your stories in a very, generous and open-hearted manner.
Oh, thank you.